Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you this morning. You might take your Bible and turn to the book of Romans and just hold that opening at Romans chapter 1. We'll refer there in a moment. One word of announcement of interest to the congregation before we get started. I learned Friday, I believe, that Brother Jeff Wilder, former preacher here, lives down in Florida now, has been diagnosed with thyroid cancer and I believe is currently hospitalized for treatment of sepsis that's related to that. So you might want to keep Brother Jeff in your prayers. We've been talking about reasons to believe from the standpoint of reasoning with someone who does not believe in God or who is uncertain about believing in God. And I think I mentioned, I'm reminded in this series of lessons a little bit of listening to Brother Thomas Warren lecture and teach on the existence of God and evolution and creation, Christian apologetics and so forth. Because my experience in listening to Brother Warren was sometimes a little bit frustrating. He would approach the subject and break it down in such very small, meticulous bites that you would look at the basic question and say, well, here's the question and the answer is obvious. And to those who believe, it is. But he wasn't appealing to those who believe. He was reasoning with those who did not believe to make the case that belief makes sense. And that's what this study is all about. Where does morality come from? We talked about this last week. What establishes the universal concept in humanity of right and wrong? What makes something good or bad? This is what we talked about last week. Well, question: is morality just something that's naturally occurring? Is it instinctive? Is it in your genes or your chromosomes? Something like that? Does morality originate in the natural world, the existing physical world around us? If a wild animal mauls a child, now, short of a tiger escaping from the zoo here, that's not likely to happen with a tiger in this country, but we hear periodically about a bear mauling someone in western states or in Alaska. Heard just the other day about someone being killed by, I believe it was by a moose cow. The guy got between the moose cow and her calf trying to take pictures of the cow, and she trampled him, killed him. Would a wild animal that mauls someone and kills them, would we put that animal on trial? Now I realize in some states, if an animal kills a person, the Department of Natural Resources is likely to go out and hunt that particular animal down and kill it, because it's recognized that that animal presents a danger to the human population. But would we go through a court trial and assess guilt or innocence about an animal? I think we all know the answer to that. How then is an animal different from a human? If a person kills another person, what do we do? How do we respond under normal circumstances? Now, I'm not talking about wartime, for example. I'm not talking about something like that. I'm not talking about a judicial execution. I'm talking about just outright murder. How do we react to that as a people, as a society? What do we do? Lock them up. Oh, okay, lock them up. Try to apprehend them so that it doesn't happen again. Keep them in custody. Lock them up. If not for their own safety, at least for the safety of everybody else around them, or most everybody else. And then somewhere in that process, that person's going to come before a judge and a jury, and their liability, their guilt or innocence will be assessed. And if they're found guilty, then we deal with that. Does the bear that mauls someone, or does that moose that trampled a man a couple of weeks ago, do those animals have a sense of morality? Okay, they have an instinct for survival, but do they have a sense of morality? Now, here's the person that says, well, you know, when my dog needs to go out and doesn't make it before it goes out, and I scold that dog, and it hangs its head and it ducks its tail, and so my dog knows right and wrong. Well, your dog or your cat or whatever your pet is knows how to respond, how to behave. It's a conditioned response in that scenario. But absent your scolding, does that dog misbehave and then feel guilty for having misbehaved? If you don't scold it, does it give it a second thought? Do animals have a sense of morality? I think we know the answer. No. Animals do what animals do. What they do instinctively. But what about people? There is a learning process. Conscience has to be educated, but even in the absence of formal education of the conscience, do people feel guilt? I recognize that there are some individuals in this world who don't seem to have any sense of guilt whatsoever. But they're aberrations. They're the exception, not the rule. The norm, people are aware of a sense of right and wrong. So that raises a question. If people, humans, have a sense of right and wrong, a sense of morality, and my dog or my horse or my cat does not, where does that sense of morality originate? Where does that sense of morality come from? Now, in the political and philosophical world, there's a lot of effort expended to try to say that right and wrong, a sense of right and wrong, the ideas of right and wrong, are purely human constructs. That the only reason that there is such a concept of right and wrong is because people have gotten together and created it. And that tries to vest all concept of right and wrong in humanity. The problem with that is that it can't explain either societies that have not progressed to that point of formalizing a code of right and wrong, and it also can't explain the aggrievement of little children. When a child is in some way treated unfairly, give this child 2 Oreos and that child 1 Oreo, how does the child know to recognize the unfairness of that treatment? You see, the idea that it originates with humanity can't explain that. If humans have morality and the animal world does not, where does morality come from? It is a learning process to some degree, to a large degree, and yet even little children are able to recognize on a basic level right and wrong. Does an animal have a conscience? Well, I think we've already addressed that a little bit, talking about the scolded puppy dog. That puppy dog learned to behave that way based on your actions. It didn't do that the first time it made a mess on the floor. But does a human have a conscience? Over in 2 Timothy chapter 1 at verse 3, the Apostle Paul talks about conscience. In chapter 1 at verse 3, he says, I thank God whom I serve, as did my ancestors, with a clear conscience, as I remember you constantly in my prayers, night and day. Go down to verse 13, and Paul says to Timothy, follow the pattern of sound words or sound doctrine that you have heard from me in faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. Follow, imitate, copy. Paul's instruction to Timothy has to do with his behavior. Does a human have a conscience? A normal, emotionally and mentally healthy human does. Well, I got ahead of myself with the verses there. Does an animal feel anything besides satisfaction after it kills prey? You see, you remember, most of us here are old enough to remember the Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins, and he would send Jack Hanna out to film the lion assaulting the dick or the little antelope or whatnot, and the lion would just drag it down and tear it apart. What emotions did the lion feel in that process? I realize for us, these seem like pedantic and simplistic questions. But for someone who doesn't believe in God, these are questions that really need to be answered, because there is an answer. Animals don't feel remorse. What about people? Yes, there are people who might not feel any remorse. Exactly. Animals are not made in the image of God. Now, the unbeliever doesn't believe that people are made in the image of God, but there are some differences between animals and people that otherwise cannot be explained. And that's what we're driving at here. Normal people feel remorse after taking another life, even accidentally. I have known people in the past who were involved in fatal automobile accidents. And even though it was an accident, because someone died, those who survived felt guilt. Were not even necessarily at fault in the accident, but they felt remorse over the loss of life. If a person has a conscience and an animal does not, if I have a conscience and my dog does not, where does conscience come from? It comes from the human spirit, but again, back up. Where does that come from? How do we, if there's not a God, how do we explain that? We can't. And that's the point. Now you look at these questions. If conscience, there is a supposition on the part of some that conscience, emotions, and so forth, that's nothing but the combination of chemicals in your head. Those chemicals don't have that effect anywhere else in the world, do they? If it's just a random interaction of chemicals, is that something you should depend on, trust? It doesn't make sense. But if conscience is something designed by a moral lawgiver, and the key word there is moral, would it be something we could trust? Something we could depend on? Romans chapter 1 says in verse 20, God's invisible attributes, namely, or specifically, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen. They're perceivable ever since the creation of the world. They're understood so that even those who do not believe in him, are without excuse. If there's evidence of something and I ignore the evidence, does that mean that it doesn't exist? In 1980, the earth around Mount St. Helens trembled. And Mount St. Helens, a long dormant volcano, smoked a little bit, shook a little bit. And seismologists and various other experts warned the people who lived in the area and even up on the slopes of Mount St. Helens, leave now while you can. And most people did. There were a few hardy souls, stubborn souls really, who refused to leave. I've lived here all my life. Nothing's ever happened before. My great-granddaddy lived here. Nothing ever happened, and so on and so forth. But in May of 1980, those who said the evidence says this volcano is about to erupt were vindicated, because Mount St. Helens blew roughly 1,200 feet off of its top. It's much shorter than it used to be. And those people were consumed. Evidence was there, and ignoring it did not make it go away, did not change the facts. Well, let's talk about another aspect of human existence. What about pain and suffering? If there is a single argument that could be presented against the existence of God, pain and suffering is the one charge that might make sense. What's the purpose of pain? It is think of it as an instinct towards self-preservation. You go to touch a hot stove or a hot barbecue pit or something like that. Before you ever touch it, if you're paying attention, what do you feel? You feel the heat. Turn on the hot water tap, leave the cold water tap off, and if your water heater is working, eventually, what's going to come out of the hot water tap? Water that's been heated hotter than the ambient temperature. When you get ready to shower in the morning, do you just step in and turn on the water? I salute you if you're that hardy soul that can take the first 30 seconds of freezing cold water. I reach in the shower and I turn the tap over to hot and I turn the hot water on and I let it run for about 30 seconds because the water heater's all the way at the other end of the house. And those copper pipes get cold. Yes, ma'am. Stimulus. Yep, they do. Yep. Any living thing. Living things react to stimulus, you're right. Plants lean toward the sun, they send roots toward the water and nutrients. Animals respond to pain stimuli, so do people. Pain is a warning device. Now, what about somebody who can't feel pain? We've probably seen the periodic little articles on TV about this person who can't feel pain. I remember years ago watching a woman on television turning bacon, frying in a pan with her bare fingers. Now, she was cautious in the sense that she had a paper towel handy and she would reach in and flip the bacon over and then she'd wipe the hot grease from her fingers before it had been on there long enough to burn her. But she had learned through experience that she needed to wipe that hot grease off before it could damage her, because even though she couldn't feel the pain of the burn, if she left it there, what was happening? Her fingers were being burned. Her fingers were being blistered. In her last few years of life, my mother suffered from diabetic neuropathy in her fingers, in her hands. And mother would burn her fingers in the kitchen without realizing it and then wonder, why do I have a blister on my knuckle? She couldn't feel it. Someone who touches a hot stove but can't feel pain is injured nonetheless, even though they don't have that sense of pain. Now, was there pain before sin? I don't know. I wasn't there. I would suppose that there would have been, or at least the potential for it, because God doesn't seem to have changed our physical nature any post-garden. There's no record of it if He did. If I make a choice and put my hand on the hot stove, what's going to happen? I'm going to hurt myself. If that happens, whose fault is it? That's mine. If I'm forced in some way to keep my hand away from that danger, has my freedom of choice been taken away? Am I still able to make that choice, at least in my mind, even if I'm prevented from it? Here you go. Even when I don't have the opportunity to hurt myself, the will to make that choice has not been removed. Well, what about the law of gravity? Where can you go in the world that the law of gravity doesn't apply? Say again? That's not in the world. In outer space. Well, outer space is not in the world. Oh, and by the way, do you know that the law of gravity applies in outer space too? It's just much less in your face, shall we say, than it is right here. There's nowhere in the world that the law of gravity does not apply. Now, it varies detectably in different parts of the world. Basically, depending on elevation. You're right. If it didn't apply, there'd be no order. You're right. So, suppose it was random. Suppose there were places in the world you could go that the law of gravity did not apply. That would be an illogical world, wouldn't it? If the law of gravity doesn't apply to you, Ray, in this area, but it does in that area. If the law of gravity only applies on ladders, I'm going to tease you a little bit, Ray. If it only applies when you're on a ladder, but not when you're off the ladder, if you ever get off the ladder, how do you get back on? By the way, where is there any kind of physical body, planet, moon, star, where gravity doesn't apply? What do we know about gravity on Mars? It's not quite as strong as it is on Earth. You weigh about 75% or 60% of what you would weigh on Earth if you were on Mars. How about the moon? On the moon, I would weigh about 50 pounds. Well, that'd be great. I could jump. I could play basketball on the moon. I could dunk the ball on the moon. What about the sun? Or let's not go where it's hot. What about Jupiter? It'd be so heavy I couldn't even breathe. Suppose you decide to test the law of gravity. Did one of your parents ever ask, if 10 other of your friends were going to go jump off a cliff, would you go jump off a cliff too? My parents never asked me that particular question, but I've known lots of kids whose parents did. If you choose to test the law of gravity, what's going to happen? Your umbrella or your bed sheet is not going to save you. If you test the law of gravity and get hurt, whose fault is it? Well, if there's a God, it must be God's fault because he let you get hurt. That's the dodge that sometimes is offered by the unbeliever. But who decided to test the law of gravity by jumping off the cliff? That wasn't God. So, if you benefit from the consistency of the law of gravity, who should get credit for that benefit? Who should be praised for the fact that it's consistent? So somebody besides, somebody, it's not us, not me. Well, do pain and suffering serve a purpose? Absolutely. They serve a warning purpose. Ooh, that's hot. I don't want to touch that. Wow, that's a long way down. Many years ago, I was in Oklahoma City with a friend, and he showed me the underground section of Oklahoma City. Did you know there's an underground to Oklahoma City? There's a whole downtown section, several blocks, where the buildings are connected under the streets, underground. You can go for several blocks in any direction from building to building to building to building without ever stepping foot on the surface of the earth. They did that back in the 30s and 40s so that people could go from place to place without having to get out in the weather. One of the buildings that is connected to this underground setting is a 30-something story office building that one of my grandfathers actually bought stock in back in the 20s. It's called the Skirvin Building. It's an impressive building, but it was a scam and a half when they were building it. The stock was absolutely worthless. And my friend Jack and I came up from the underground in the lobby of the bank that was on the ground floor of the Skirvin Building. Very, very ornate. And he said, you ought to see the view from up here. So we went over to an elevator and went as high as the elevator would go. 31st floor, something like that. And walked out, and there were no windows. But that was not the top floor. So over here was a stairwell, and we went up about 3 or 4 more flights of stairs and came out into a corridor, and there were no windows. But over here was another stairwell in the middle of the building that went up. So we went up, nobody to tell us not to, not a soul up there besides us. We got to the very tip top of the building. At the very tip top of the Skirvin Building, there's a dining room that would seat about 20 people. Windows all the way around. It's an impressive view. But more than that, there's a door. Now, there's no balcony, but there's a door, Jim. And it wasn't locked. It opens onto a steel fire escape with fire stairs that go down, go down, go down, go down, and all the way down to the ground. I did not go down the stairs. I did open the door. And I stepped back and shut the door real quick. It took my breath away. That's the only time in my life I have suffered from vertigo. And I suffered from vertigo for about 5 seconds and said, nope, and closed that door. Because I realized if I stepped out there on this little landing about this big square, even though it had a railing around it, there'd have to be a hot fire behind me to get me out there. I don't want to fall that far. Pain and suffering serve a beneficial purpose. Yes, pain warns you of imminent danger, and suffering teaches you don't do that again. James alludes to that when he says in James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, my brethren, count it all joy. And that's a funny word, funny perspective in a way. Count it all joy when you fall into manifold temptations, various trials, knowing that the testing or the proving, the assaying of your faith produces patience. Now, question, is punishment necessary for morality, for right and wrong? if there's no consequence to wrongdoing, how is it wrong? Does justice demand that a convicted criminal be punished by a judge? Justice does. Justice by itself is simply the determination of right and wrong. This is right, this is wrong. If a judge sets free a convicted criminal without any penalty, has justice been done? No, it has not. The scales of justice, in a sense, have not been balanced. But if the judge determines guilt, assesses a penalty, and that penalty is enforced, you're going away for life, does that somehow make that judge an unloving person? In fact, what do we expect of our judges? What's the word that we use to describe the attitude that we want our judges to have? Well, jurisprudence is the process. Blind is a way of describing it, but what we mean by that word is impartial, exactly. Not favoring one side or the other, but simply determining the truth. Assessing the facts, determining the truth. Whether the judge feels affinity for or disdain for the person in the docket shouldn't enter into that decision whatsoever. People being people, sometimes it does, but that's beside the point. Is it possible for a judge to be both fair and loving toward all people? Okay, maybe not a human judge, but in concept. Go ahead. Okay. The question hinges on recognizing the difference between fairness and love. Because what does fair have to do with? Say again? Justice. It has to do with the facts. Did this happen? Is this the penalty for this? What about love? Love is not an assessment of the facts only. Love introduces into the equation the attitude, the emotion, the feelings of the judge. Now, when we deal with a criminal court among people, how the judge feels about the person shouldn't make any difference, should it? Because that's not the basis of judgment. The law is the basis of judgment. What does the law say? Go ahead, Joan. Okay. Okay, among men then, sometimes the judge is given discretion. There is perhaps a range of responses based on circumstances and so forth. But in the abstract, justice has nothing to do with love. Love is not a function of justice. If God exists, assuming that God is a fair God, a just God, for him to be fair, would he be required to punish those who are guilty of sin? Okay. Okay. Hugh gets to something that we do need to touch just for a moment, and that's the meaning of required, because he said, well, wait a minute, now we can't say that, because if God is required, that means there's somebody above God requiring it of him. But in this context, we're talking about God being consistent with the very concept of God. So there's not anybody above him to require, to enforce on him, but he himself, to be God, the definition of God, would he have to be consistent in punishing those who are guilty of sin? There'd be no purpose for law, there'd be no purpose for God in that setting. If he does not punish those who are guilty of sin, who are guilty, who have committed sin, is he a just God? Is he being fair? That wouldn't make sense. So, would he somehow be unloving if he does act consistently and punish those who are guilty of sin? Just like the human judge, again, justice and love are distinct, different things. But if God exists, and we know he does, could he be both just and loving toward all people? If you're a parent, have you ever treated your child fairly in an instance where they misbehaved? If you do this, you're going to get a spanking or a timeout or lose a privilege or what have you. And they did that, and you imposed the penalty. Okay, that's fair. They did that, you imposed the penalty. You must not love them anymore because you imposed the penalty. You were fair to them. You still love your child? Of course you do. And in fact, you impose the penalty for the benefit of the child. If God exists, could he be both fair and just? Absolutely. That's part of the concept of God. You think about this, Revelation chapter 15 and verse 3 says, they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, great and marvelous are your works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the saints. And yet he loves us just the same. Well, quickly, could we say that willingness to punish immoral actions is necessary for God to be God? If he's not willing to punish immorality, how could he be God? Is it reasonable? And again, let me pause here. I realize this is, on one level, this is very frustrating in a sense to people who believe in God. But we're talking about dealing with people who don't and trying to reason with them. Is it reasonable to believe that if nothing existed in the beginning, then nothing would exist now? Take God out of the picture, how could there be anything? Is it more reasonable to believe that the earth with all of the complexities of the universe around us just blink, came into existence out of nothing on its own, or that someone created it. Think about where we started a couple of weeks ago. Look at the building around you. Who built this building? Oh, nobody built it. It just appeared one day. What does Hebrews 3 and verse 4 tell us? Every house is built by someone, but he who made all things is God. Is it more reasonable to believe that the human body with all of its complexities is just accidental, or that it was deliberately created? What makes more sense? Is it reasonable to believe that morality could exist without a moral lawgiver? Is it reasonable to believe that it exists because there's a moral lawgiver? What about pain? Can a person be just and punish evildoers without being unloving? What it comes down to is this: is it reasonable to believe in the existence of God? You see, the unbeliever says, oh, you believe in God, you have blind faith. This is not about blind faith, this is about informed, reasonable faith. That's where all this goes. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. We'll talk about this from a little different standpoint next week, Lord willing.